Hello, this is Charles Bernard, and I paint science fiction and fantasy paperback book covers. Welcome once again to the Art Trek video series, which is your alternative to art school. In this series, I analyze paintings for their design and composition. This is Volume 9, Part 1 of a two-part video that focuses on plans of organization. These plans are the principles of design that organize the elements of design. And if you do not have a clear and precise knowledge and understanding of the principles of design and composition, that will then be reflected in your work. Someone who does have this knowledge and understanding will be able to tell at a glance when looking at your paintings whether you know what you're doing or not. If you've been following the Art Trek video series, studying hard and applying what I have been showing you to your own paintings, then you are well on your way to mastering design and composition. And it will be reflected in your paintings. No artist, no matter how great, from Michelangelo to Rembrandt to the greatest illustrators that have ever lived, are born with the knowledge of design and composition. It is something that must be learned. Once you've gained knowledge and understanding of design and composition, and you look at some of the work that the greatest artists of all time have done when they were still very young, before they actually learned about design and composition, you can immediately see that they had no clue as to what makes a great painting. They had no clue as to the knowledge and understanding of design and composition. They may have had an ability at an early age to draw something that looks reasonably well compared to the object that they were drawing. But that doesn't mean that they had any knowledge or understanding of what design and composition are all about, of what art is all about. That only means that they had some kind of skill, that they were able to copy something that looked reasonably like the object that they were copying. It is only later, when these great artists found the right source from which they could learn about design and composition, that they then, through hard work and study, started to really begin to understand what art is all about. The key is to find the right source that will teach you what you need to know so that you can gain some understanding of what art is really all about. And this pursuit for greater knowledge and understanding about art is a lifelong endeavor. The moment you think that you know everything there is to know, that there's no more that I can learn about art, that is the moment that you will stop growing as an artist. You will be frozen in your tracks, and others will pass you by. And now it's time to begin. In Volume 8 of the Art Trek video series, I started talking about plans of organization, but then I ran out of time and I had to stop short. In this video, I will be continuing with that subject. Now, a word about the principles of design that are listed here. A principle of design is a law of relationship or plan of organization that will determine how the elements of design listed here will be combined. There are only three ways in which the elements of design can be combined. And one of the ways in which they can be combined is to form repetition, which is what you see in this example here. Now, a unit such as this has various dimensions. It has shape, it has value, it has direction, which is a vertical direction, upwards like this. It has a particular size. It has a texture, in this case a very smooth texture, and it has a color, as well as the last dimension, which is line. it has 7 dimensions. In repetition, you repeat each one of these dimensions in the other unit, which is this one. And this creates repetition. Focusing now on design, principles of design. Now, the other way in which the elements of design can be combined is to form harmony. Here, there is still exact repetition. But in order to create harmony, one of the dimensions that I listed needs to be changed. If only one dimension is changed, harmony is created, and you no longer have exact repetition. What you have is the introduction of change or contrast. And harmony involves both repetition and contrast. If I change more than one dimension, I still have harmony, but less harmony. The more dimensions I change, the less harmony there is. The more similar the units are, the more harmony there is, until they become exactly alike, and then you wind up with repetition instead of harmony. Now I'm going to change just one of the dimensions, and that dimension will be size. And I'll bring down the size a little bit. Harmony results from elements of design that look similar when a little bit of change has taken place, and not too much change. Then you have harmony, such as in this case now. I changed one of the dimensions, and that dimension was size, but all the other dimensions have been kept the same. The dimension of direction has been kept the same. That hasn't changed. The shape hasn't changed. The texture hasn't changed. The smooth surface texture. The color hasn't changed. The value hasn't changed. Everything remains the same except for size. In spite of the differences that are introduced into the units, which means contrast is introduced, and there can be more or less contrast introduced. But in spite of that, harmony can be maintained if those differences are not too great, and the units continue to look similar. Now, if I want more change to be introduced, I can change another dimension, which is value. For example, if I turn these into gray, you can see that both have the same value. If I make a change to one of these values, then that value needs to be changed just a little bit in order to maintain a harmony of values. There is still a harmony of sizes because the sizes of the shapes are similar. But if I want to maintain a harmony of values, then one of the values that I change needs to look similar to the other in order to achieve harmony. So if I change, let's say, the smaller size to a slightly darker value, something like that, I have harmony in spite of making that value darker. It hasn't been made so dark that there is no longer a similarity of values, which would result in a relationship that is not harmonious. And here's what it looks like in color. You can see that it's a darker value, and there's a nice pleasing relationship between these shapes. Change has been introduced, and there is no longer exact repetition like in this example here, but here there is repetition with variation, or as it's also called, varied repetition or harmonic repetition. And this kind of repetition with variation is more interesting than this kind of repetition where nothing changes, where each of the dimensions are repeated and there is no change introduced. I'm going to change another dimension in this harmony, and that dimension will be color. The large triangle will be changed to a red violet. And by introducing another change, I've created more variety. And the more variety that is added, the more interesting this arrangement becomes. There's a similarity between the colors. And again, as I mentioned before, harmony is the result of elements of design that are similar, where the differences aren't too great, where there isn't a lot of contrast, just a little bit of contrast that has been introduced. These colors are closely related on the color wheel. Here is the color wheel, and you can see those colors down here. They are next to each other. All the colors on this color wheel that are next to each other, such as the yellow, yellow-green, or yellow-orange and yellow, or yellow-green and green, they are in harmony because they are next to each other on the color wheel. Therefore, they are closely related. This is called the Munsell color wheel, and I highly suggest that you memorize this color wheel because it's going to be very useful to you. There are other color wheels, but the Munsell color wheel is the one that I like the best and the one that I find most useful. If you use colors that are diametrically opposite each other, such as yellow and violet, then you won't be able to achieve this kind of harmony. The harmony is the result of colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. Although you could use a color that's a little further away, but the farther away you get from one of the colors that are dominant within your arrangement, such as yellow, for example, then the less and less harmony will be the result of the arrangement in terms of color. And now I'd like to turn your attention to design, elements of design. In this example here, I'm showing the various elements of design, such as a line, direction, value, color, size, texture, and shape. Those elements that are next to each other, such as here, in this example, they are in harmony because this curve is just slightly different from the straight line. And these two lines are in harmony because this curve is just slightly different from this curve. And again, these two lines are in harmony because they have a similarity of curve, and so do these two. The farther away you get from the straight line, the more curved a line becomes, the greater the contrast and the less the harmony. The same thing with direction that you see here. These directions that are next to each other are similar and therefore harmonious. As you get further away from the vertical direction, the contrast of direction is increased and becomes less harmonious. Again, with value. Those values that are next to each other on the value scale here are in harmony, and those that are further apart, such as the white and the black, are in strong contrast with each other. Now, with shape that you see here, those shapes that are next to each other like these two are in harmony. Shapes farther away, such as these two here, the triangle and the circle, are in sharp contrast with each other and not harmonious. So in order for there to be shape harmony, they need to be next to each other. There needs to be only small differences in the shapes. Otherwise, there is no harmony. As to size, which is indicated here, the same as with shape. Those sizes next to each other, such as these two, are in harmony. This size and this size contrast more and are not in harmony. But these two sizes are in harmony because their sizes are more similar than this size and this size is. As it comes to texture, indicated here, the same holds true. Those textures, such as these two next to each other, are more similar than this texture, and therefore these two are in harmony, as are these two, because of their similarity. But these two are not in harmony because the differences of texture are too great. This is more smooth and this is more rough. Now, returning back to principles of design, I'm going to change the value of this triangle, which is one of the dimensions of this unit. And I'm going to change that value quite a bit by introducing a lot of contrast. More contrast than is needed to achieve harmony. Now I'll introduce that darker value, and as you can see, it's quite a bit darker than the value of the larger triangle. Because I introduced this strong value contrast into this harmonious combination, I've made it much more interesting. It is through the introduction of strong contrast that an arrangement can be made even more interesting. If I go back and show you what it looked like before I introduced this darker value, you can see that this combination is not as interesting as this one is. All these differences that I have introduced in these shapes or units, whether minor contrasts resulting in similarity or major contrasts resulting in greater differences, add variety to this arrangement and therefore make it much more interesting than this arrangement of exact repetition. While there is strong contrast in one dimension, the dimension of value, there are less contrasts in other dimensions that make them similar and therefore put this arrangement into harmony. The dimension of size, for example, is similar to this size, and the dimension of shape. They both have the same shape, as well as color. The value has been changed, but the color, or hue, has not. It's still violet. So there are still enough similarities in spite of the strong contrast that make this arrangement harmonious. What I've been trying to make clear in this example is that even though you introduce strong contrasts within a harmonious arrangement, that doesn't mean that there is no longer any harmony. It is those other dimensions that remain similar that provide the harmony, and the strong contrasts that provide the interest. So, this example clearly demonstrates that units that are contrasting in one dimension, such as this value, contrast with this value, can be harmonized by another dimension, such as a similar shape. That's what puts them in harmony. It's not the strong value contrasts that put them in harmony, but rather the similar sizes, as well as other dimensions that are similar or that have been repeated exactly the same, such as the repetition of the same shape, as well as similar color, because this red-violet is close on the color wheel to the violet, as you can see here where the color wheel is. Therefore, the additional dimension of color also harmonizes these shapes, as I've already previously pointed out. But I'm just repeating to remind you and to make things clearer. So you see, within a harmonious arrangement, like in this demonstration, contrast, repetition, and harmony are all combined. Extremes, such as extreme value contrast, color, line, shape, and so forth, can therefore be harmonized. This principle that I just demonstrated in this example on how units that are contrasting in one dimension or element may be harmonized by another can also be applied to texture, value, color, line, and direction, for example. I'm going to show you some other elements of design that are in extreme contrast, and I'll show you how they can be harmonized. If you look at these two lines here, they are in sharp contrast with each other. One is white, the other is black. One has a vertical direction, the other has a horizontal direction. So they contrast sharply in terms of value and direction, as well as in terms of their line. One is straight and the other is curved. So all of the dimensions are different between these two lines. By giving these two extreme contrasting lines the same direction, which is a vertical direction, they are now harmonized. So here again is another example of extremes being harmonized. They contrast sharply in all other dimensions, size, value, and line, but they both share the same vertical direction. That direction has been repeated, and therefore they are in harmony, in spite of the other contrasting dimensions. In this example, you can see two strong contrasting textures. That's what I want to focus on here. And this texture, as you can see, is very rough compared to the smoother texture here. How can these two contrasting textures be harmonized? So already there is a connection between these two in terms of shape. But the connection or harmony can be strengthened even more by giving them the same direction, just as I did with the line. Now, while they still contrast, of course, in texture, they are now brought into a more harmonious relationship because they share similar shapes and the same direction. So there are two dimensions that they so far share. If I make the sizes more similar, then another dimension, the dimension of size, is added, thereby creating even more harmony between the two. So in this arrangement, some contrasts are left strong, such as the contrast of color, red and blue, and the strong contrast of texture, rough and smoother. But other dimensions are made more similar or repeated, and therefore this arrangement is in harmony in spite of some strong contrasts of dimensions. If I continued to change the other dimensions so that more of them are similar or the same, the harmony will be strengthened. How much harmony you want in your composition or how little depends on the mood you want to create, the effect you want to create. By darkening the value of this texture, making it more closely related to this value, I can strengthen the connection and harmony even more. For example, by doing this, reducing the value of the highlights, I'll show you that these two values are very similar. They're both dark, and therefore they are in harmony in terms of value. Now the texture is less rough looking and a little more closely related to this texture. If I continue to smooth out this texture, then the two textures will be similar and therefore more in harmony. And then the entire arrangement will be much more harmonious, and I will have lost the strong contrast of textures. As you can see, these two shapes here are in sharp contrast to each other. This shape has a rectangular quality to it and is irregular, as you can see. And so is this shape. It's irregular. However, the character of this shape is curving. So the two shapes contrast quite sharply with each other in terms of their character, but also in terms of their color. As well as their size, this one is much larger than this size, and the values also are not similar. And I'll show you what they look like by turning it to a grayscale. You see, one is darker and the other is lighter. So there are quite a few dimensions that contrast with each other rather than harmonize. They also differ in direction. This shape has a vertical direction, while this one is more at an angle. While these shapes contrast in certain dimensions, they can be harmonized in others, as I have already shown in other examples. Repeating only one of the dimensions of a unit, such as I did here with the repetition of direction, that is enough to place them in harmony. If I want to strengthen the harmonious relationship, I need to repeat other dimensions as well. I made a few more changes in order to harmonize these two shapes more. One of the things I did was to reduce the intensity of this red hue. Now it's similar in intensity to the blue-violet here. I made one more additional change, as you can see, to both of these shapes. I gave them both a similar texture, thereby further harmonizing these shapes. Now, many of the dimensions are similar, in spite of some dimensions that still contrast strongly. The result of all of this is varied repetition, or repetition with variation, or harmonic repetition. And repetition with variation is the most interesting kind of repetition, and that is the kind that you need to introduce into your compositions to really make them exciting and interesting visually. So you can have strong contrast within your composition and still have harmony, as I have shown you in all of these examples. In addition to what I've been saying about harmony, by repeating one or more of the dimensions of a unit, you can also integrate that opposing unit with another unit and thereby achieve unity to make one complete whole. Now I'd like to focus on harmony and how it applies to an actual painting rather than to just diagrams like I've been showing you. Here is a rough color sketch that I did of an astronaut that has crash landed, and he manages to survive and get out of the spacecraft, but only to be greeted by an imminent danger that awaits him. Using this color sketch, I'll show you how harmony can be created and maintained within the composition in spite of the introduction of strong contrasts. It is what I talked about using this diagram here, where I showed you that some dimensions are harmonized while others contrast. But in spite of that, the organization of the whole remains harmonious. I use a limited number of colors for this color scheme, which are yellow, blue, violet, and red-violet. When you work with a restricted or limited range of colors, make sure that that range extends far enough to include a balancing warm color to the cool colors or a cool color to the warm colors. In my color scheme, that balancing color is the yellow. In this diagram, there is color harmony because, as I mentioned earlier, within this blue-violet, there is red and blue. And within this red-violet, there is red and blue. So the two primaries, red and blue, are common to both of these colors, and therefore the colors are closely related and in harmony. In my color sketch, the same occurs. The dominant colors, or group of colors, a group of colors can be dominant if they are closely related, such as in my case, where violet and red-violet are the dominating colors. However, one color more than the other should dominate in terms of taking up more area. And in my color sketch, that color is the violet. There is more violet than there is red-violet. The idea is to create irregular intervals of sizes of areas of color, so that no two areas of color have the same size or take up the same amount of area. Harmony can be seen throughout my color sketch. It is created by the closely related colors of red, violet, and violet. The blue that I use here on the figure, as well as these figures and then other parts of this color sketch that I'm outlining here, that is also related to the violet and the red violet because there is blue within the violet and the red violet. However, the blue is not as closely related to the violet and the red violet as is the red violet to violet. But nevertheless, it's still in harmony with those colors. Varied repetition can be found within harmony. And my color sketch is predominantly harmonious, within which varied repetition can be found. Using this diagram, if you remember, I talked about certain dimensions are harmonized while others are in sharp contrast. And this is what occurs in my color sketch. Certain dimensions, such as color, shape, or value, are harmonized while others are not. But if you remember, I said that even though some dimensions may not be in harmony with others, that doesn't mean that the arrangement as a whole is not harmonious. Because if they don't harmonize in one dimension, they will harmonize in another dimension, therefore, or thereby, connecting them, uniting them through those other dimensions that they have in common. The shape of this figure here has a curving character to it. It is a curved shape. But other shapes in this composition, like this large shape of the crashed spaceship, has an angular character to it. Since these two shapes contrast sharply with each other, they need to be harmonized. But how do you harmonize two contrasting shapes? If you've been following what I've been saying, you'll know the answer to this question. If you look at this diagram here, both shapes have the same character. But if I changed this triangle to a circle, I now have a circular shape in contrast to a triangle shape. The two shapes contrast strongly with each other, just as these shapes do in my color sketch. In this example, now that I've changed the small triangle to a circle, even though they are contrasting in shape, they harmonize in color because the two colors are closely related on the color wheel. They are in harmony because each contains the primary colors of red and blue. And so it is in my color sketch. The blue color on the figure relates to the violet color and red violet in this contrasting shape. The two colors are in harmony, just as these two colors are in harmony. So these contrasting shapes in my color sketch are harmonized through the dimension of color, because both share the same color, which is blue. The figure is blue, and there is blue in violet. However, it is not only through the dimension of color that the two opposing shapes are harmonized, but also through the dimension of value. They both share a similar value. This harmonious relationship in the diagram can be strengthened by giving both a similar value or repeating the same value. By darkening this value here to something like this, now there is a stronger bond between the two than there was before, because a similar dimension, that of value, has been repeated. I'll change this to a grayscale so that you can see how similar these values are. You see, this value is similar to this value, and just as in this diagram where these values are similar. They're almost the same. I can't harmonize these two shapes through texture because the texture on the figure is a soft texture. His clothing is soft compared to the hard metal texture of the spacecraft. So through the dimension of texture, they cannot be harmonized, but through value and color, they can. While the textures contrast sharply with each other, one is soft and the other is hard, color and value, those dimensions are similar or the same. So you see, the units within a composition can contrast in one dimension and contrast sharply, but harmonize in other dimensions. And this is what I've been showing you all along using this diagram as an example. But now you're seeing it being applied to an actual painting. While there are these angular shapes that dominate this composition, there are also shapes that oppose them, and they are the curved shapes, as I've already pointed out with the man. And then there are curved shapes found in these sand dunes. The way these sand dunes are harmonized with the contrasting shapes of the spacecraft are through the dimension of color. Red-violet found on the spacecraft is repeated within the sand dunes, thereby harmonizing the two contrasting shapes. The yellow sun is harmonized not through color because the hue is so different from the other hues found elsewhere in the composition that you can't harmonize this yellow curved shape with other hues, or put another way, through the dimension of color. As long as you have another area or shape or form that a contrasting hue, such as this yellow curved shape, can harmonize with, it will not remain isolated and will become part of the greater whole. In this case, the value of this yellow sun is similar to the value found at the horizon by the sand dunes here. Therefore, I'm connecting or harmonizing this yellow sun to a part of the composition, which is this horizon. Also, because of the curved shape, it harmonizes with the curved shape of the figure, as well as the curved shape of the sand dunes. Therefore, this yellow sun does not remain isolated from the rest of the composition. It is tied in with other parts of the composition, not through the dimension of hue or color, but through other dimensions such as the value and the shape. By repeating that circle throughout the composition, I'm further tying in the circle of the sun with other parts of the composition, and further ensuring that this circular yellow sun shape is not isolated from the rest of the composition. The yellow hue of the sun acts as a hue discord, which enriches the harmony of the whole. It adds variety and zest to the color design. It can also add vigor, vitality, and interest to the color design. So a hue discord has an important function within the harmony of a color design. In addition to the yellow discord, I also added a green and yellow-green discord, as well as a small bright red accent. It's not really a discord because the color is not sufficiently different enough from the others to be a discord hue. But it adds a nice little accent here, which helps to increase the interest. As for the sky area, it has been harmonized with other parts of the composition through the dimension of color as well as shape, because the sky has an angular or triangular shape to it, just as other parts of the composition have triangular or angular shapes, such as I have already pointed out. This spaceship, and this is triangular here, or angular shapes all over. It is the red-violet in the sky that is repeated throughout other parts of the colored sketch, with variations of this red-violet, where in some places the red-violet is brighter, in others it's more neutralized or it has been grayed more. But in spite of its variations, it remains closely related to the other colors found in other parts of the composition, and therefore harmonizes with those other parts. When you select a discord or discordant colors to be notes of color within your color design, make sure that they are far enough removed from the dominant or subordinate colors, which in my case are these colors here. And the yellow and green and yellow-green actually are the discord colors, and they are far enough removed from these dominant colors to not be confused with them. They must read clearly, and they do in my color sketch. If a discordant color is small enough, like this gun here in my color sketch, then you may be able to get away without trying to harmonize it with something else in the composition. Since a color discord should act as a kind of irritant within the color design, and not harmonizing it with something else, it becomes more of an irritant. But remember, this only works for very small color discords. If they are larger, like the yellow sun here, then you need to harmonize them with something else. Here is another version of the sketch. As you can see, I changed the color in the sky and the ground area. I used a stronger character contrast, which gives me a different mood from the previous sketch. In this one, the mood is more exciting, more dramatic, because of the strong contrast of warm and cool colors that do not exist to this extreme in the previous sketch. More warm colors are introduced, and they take up a larger area. They appear in the sky and the ground area here. There's an orange color that I added, which contrasts sharply with its complement blue on the figure. There are more complementary colors, which help to create a more exciting mood. The yellow is a complement to the violet found on the spacecraft. So there are two sets of complements: the blue with the orange in the sky, and the yellow with the violet on the spacecraft. The orange color in the sky has a brighter intensity, but it is not of maximum intensity. You see this orange that I'm indicating now? How much brighter that orange is than the orange in the sky. So the orange in the sky has been reduced in its intensity, but it still looks somewhat bright compared to the other colors. But this orange color is harmonized with a contrasting color of red-violet through their similarity of intensity, but also because there is red in the orange and there is red within the red-violet, as well as in the violet. And that common color, the primary color of red that appears in all of these colors, helps to harmonize the sky color with the rest of the color. Although the harmony isn't very strong because the orange is a little distance away from the red-violet. The closer colors are on the color wheel, the more harmonious they are. The farther away they are, the less harmonious they are. Here's the other version, and you can see the mood is somewhat more tranquil compared to this mood. The result of all that I've been talking about and that I have done in this color sketch is varied repetition. Harmony is varied repetition. And I have shown you how this can be achieved. And now back to design, principles of design. So you see, here I have demonstrated that units or shapes that are contrasting in one dimension may be harmonized by another. These contrast in value, but are harmonized by other dimensions such as similar size, the same shape that is repeated, and a similar color. If you noticed, I said that the same shape was repeated, not that the shapes are similar. This means that you can repeat the same dimension of a unit without having it appear similar. Thereby, you're introducing repetition without any change. So there's no similarity. There is, however, the exact same shape. Similarity would happen if I changed the shape somewhat. But remember, in order for there to be harmony, that change cannot be too great. Not too great of a contrast in the differences of the shapes must be introduced, otherwise there's no harmony. I went ahead and changed the shape of this triangle somewhat. I made it a little more narrower. The change hasn't been that great, not so great that there is no longer a similarity of shape between these shapes. And because the shape hasn't been changed radically, the shapes are still in harmony. So you see, while these units contrast sharply in one dimension, such as the much darker value, they harmonize in other dimensions because of less contrast that has been introduced, and therefore similarity has been established instead of strong contrast. By making this change in the shape, I've introduced even more variety within this arrangement. And the more variety there is, the more interest there is. But don't create so much variety through a lot of different contrasts that you lose the harmony. And if you lose the harmony, and you have all of these different strong contrasts which compete with each other, then it is no longer harmony that dominates, but rather it's the separate individual units that are competing for attention because of their strong contrasts with each other that will dominate. And here is an example of what I mean when there is too much contrast and no harmony. It's these individual shapes that are fighting with each other for attention. They dominate. There is no plan of organization or principle of design that dominates over them. And I see a lot of paintings in which this occurs. There is just too much competition between the individual shapes within the composition. They're all competing for attention. And no plan of organization has been introduced or imposed upon the shapes to keep that competition from happening. But in addition to which plan you use, whether repetition or harmony, these are plans of organization. More likely you will be using harmony than exact repetition, because with harmony you can create more variety and therefore more interest. But in addition to that plan, you also need to impose dominance on these competing elements of design. Otherwise, the competition will remain. And I talked a lot about dominance and how to eliminate competing units like these in Volume 8. So if you didn't get a chance to see Volume 8, I highly recommend that you check it out. And now for the third way in which the elements of design can be combined. I've already gone over repetition, where you repeat the exact same dimensions of one unit within the other without changing any of them. Then there is harmony, where you combine the units and introduce change. The third and last way in which the elements of design can be combined is to combine them to form contrast. In this case, there is very strong contrast resulting in what is called discord. Discord is extreme contrast, where all the dimensions of each unit are completely different from the other unit. They have nothing in common, and therefore they are not in harmony, but they are in extreme contrast. This shape here, in the middle of these, represents harmony. And I did this diagram this way to show you that harmony lies between repetition, which results in monotony, and extreme contrast, which is discord. Harmony lies between these two extremes. It combines the character of both monotony or repetition and extreme contrast or discord. So to get that point across, I combine some of what is in this shape and this shape with this shape. And therefore I have part of the shape a straight diagonal and then the other part a curve. So it combines some of the extremes of both of these shapes, which harmony requires. Different degrees of contrast and repetition can be introduced, as I pointed out here. This arc value is a greater contrast than the size differences or the shape differences. So different degrees of contrast can be introduced into a harmonious arrangement to make that arrangement even more interesting. If there is too much harmony and too little contrast, then there will not be enough interest because there isn't enough variety. But when you introduce major and minor contrasts, then the interest is increased because there is a greater amount of variety, and you wind up with harmonic repetition or varied repetition, which is the most interesting kind of repetition. Now, if you combine all your elements of design within your composition to form a lot of different contrasts like this, then, as I pointed out before, these different units will all be competing for attention. These units are all competing, first of all, through their size, because each shape is of the same size, each shape is commanding the same amount of attention. If I made one shape larger, then there would be one shape that commands more attention than the others, but that's not the case. Also, each color has the same amount of intensity. The intensity of this red is the same as the blue, and the blue intensity is the same as the yellow. They're all bright intensities, although the yellow is the brightest. But there isn't enough variety of intensities here, where one intensity of color will stand out more than the other. They're too similar in intensity for any one to stand out more than the other. Therefore, they're all fighting for attention in terms of intensity as well as size. And each unit is a different shape, and there is no one shape that is commanding more attention than another. So therefore, they're also competing in terms of shape for attention. And each one of these shapes is, of course, a different color. There is no one color that stands out more than any other. Therefore, they're also competing in terms of color. Each one wants the same amount of attention. All these conflicts that I've pointed out to you that exist within these units can be resolved through dominance and through imposing a plan of organization upon the elements in conflict. So you see what happens when you introduce too much of this contrast. Then you get this kind of competition that's going on between all the elements of design. So keep your contrast under control, but you have to introduce enough contrast, like I did here, in order to make your composition interesting. Otherwise, you wind up with dull repetition like this. Now, I'm going to focus on design irregularity. I'd like to turn your attention to irregular intervals. Irregularity is an important rule of composition and design because through it, variety can be achieved, and through variety, interest is created. Irregularity is what makes your compositions dynamic. Regularity implies uniformity, sameness, like you see here in this example of repetition, while irregularity is found here in varied repetition or harmony. And that's where the greatest interest lies. Regularity or uniformity results in monotony, and monotony is boring, and if that's what your composition has, then your composition is boring, and no one is going to want to look at it. Now, what do I mean by irregular intervals? Using this diagram and this one, I'll show you exactly what that means and how it applies to your paintings to make them interesting. When you decide on which colors you're going to use in your composition, that is, what the color scheme is going to be, you need to pick colors from this color wheel that are at unequal distances from each other. Which means that if you select yellow, and then the next color you select is, let's say, its complement, violet, the distance from the yellow to the violet is a long distance. That means there is a major interval of space between these two colors. And that major interval space I can show here in this diagram, which may make it more clear. The yellow is over here, and the violet is over here. So therefore, this is the interval of space from the yellow to the violet. It's a long interval. With this major interval of space, I'm creating a major color contrast. The distance from the yellow to the violet, as I mentioned, is a long distance represented by this long white line. So there is a major interval of space. Now, I need to also create minor color contrasts, where the contrast of color isn't so strong as it is now between the yellow and the violet. In order to do that, I need to select a color from the color wheel where the distance between one color and the other is shorter than the distance between the yellow and the violet. So I could select a blue, for example, and by selecting the blue, the distance between the violet and the blue is much shorter than the distance between the violet and the yellow. Therefore, because of the shorter interval of space, the contrast of these colors is not as strong as the contrast between yellow and violet. The shorter the intervals of space between the colors, the less those colors contrast with each other. But now I've also created another interval of space between the yellow and the blue, and that interval of space is shorter than the longest interval, but longer than the shortest interval. So I have a variety of intervals of space between these colors, and that creates major and minor color contrasts, which a composition must have in order for it to be interesting. Showing you the intervals of space here, the interval running from yellow to blue is this distance. You can see that it's shorter than the interval from yellow to violet, and then the other interval from blue to violet is like that. So as you can see, there are a variety of different intervals of space. No two intervals of space must be the same. If they are the same, then you have regularity. And regularity results in boredom, which is exact repetition, what you see here in this example. Irregularity is the basis of interesting design. If I had picked blue-green, which is right here, then the distance from the yellow to the blue-green is the same distance as the blue-green is to the violet. Therefore, I would wind up with equal intervals of space. And because of those equal intervals of space, I would wind up with color contrasts that are not as interesting as those colors that I had selected previously where the intervals of space varied. As you can see here, I've indicated the distances between the yellow and the blue-green and the blue-green and the violet, and those intervals of space are the same, and therefore there is no variety in the intervals of space, and because of that, these kind of color contrasts would not be as interesting as if I selected colors from the color wheel with unequal intervals of space between them, like I did before. What I just showed you about selecting colors at unequal intervals from the color wheel, the same applies to selecting values from the value scale. If you select white and black to be in your composition, and then the third value as a middle value that falls exactly between the white and the black, then you're going to wind up with equal intervals of space, like this. There will also be one more interval, and that will be a major interval, the longest interval representing the distance between the white and the black. A more interesting variety of contrasts of values can be achieved if you do not select a value halfway between the white and the black, but rather if you drop down one value below that middle value, or go above that middle value, one value, or two values, or even three values, it doesn't matter as long as the value is not exactly halfway between the white and the black. Let's say I select this value, the low middle value. Now the intervals of space will change, and they will all be of different lengths, giving me the greatest variety of major and minor value contrasts. As you can see, now all the intervals of space are different. There is irregularity of intervals of space, and not regularity. Here are two very rough sketches that I did just to show you what each looks like when a different middle value has been used. In this example here, I used this middle value that falls exactly between the white and the black, resulting in equal intervals of space. And this one was done with a low middle value that falls just below this value on the value scale. In this example, where there is a greater variety of irregular intervals of space on the value scale, there is a greater variety of contrasts of values, ranging from minor to major. You have this also of minor and major contrasts here, but because this value falls right in the middle, there isn't that kind of variety of major and minor contrasts of value that you find in this example. And therefore, this example is the more interesting one. When you look at this value and you look at this one, the contrast between this value and this one is quite a bit. Now, when you look at this sketch here, the contrast between this dark value and this value is less than it is between these two values here. Can you see the difference? And you see that this value contrast is less than this is. Here there is more contrast between the black and the gray than there is here. Now, the difference between this black and this gray contrast is the same kind of difference between this gray and the white. But in this example here, the difference between this gray and the white is greater in contrast than the difference between this gray and this white in contrast. So there is this variety of different degrees of value contrast in this example. In this example, those same varied different degrees of value contrast do not exist like they do in this example. Don't you think that this example looks more interesting than this one does? Here I've indicated what the major and minor value contrasts are in this example. Due to the irregularity of the intervals of space between the values, this is the kind of differences in value contrasts that are created as a result of those irregular intervals. And as you can see, there is quite a bit of a variety of differences in value contrasts. There is this contrast between the white and the low middle value, which isn't as strong as this contrast between the white and the black value. And then you have the least strong value contrast between the low middle value and the black. So you see, because of this variety of intervals of distances between the values, where all of these distances or intervals are different, you get this variety of contrasts of value ranging from major to middle to minor. And this variety creates the interest that you find in this sketch as opposed to this sketch. I did this diagram here, which represents this sketch. And as you can see, this doesn't look as interesting as this does, because there isn't the kind of variety of irregular intervals of space between the values that you find here. When you compare the two, you can clearly see that this looks much more interesting than this does. Here, you don't see the kind of variety of major and minor value contrast that you see here. Here I did a couple of quick rough color sketches to show you what the color schemes look like that I selected earlier when I selected a yellow, a violet, and a blue-green. This scheme is this color sketch here. And then the other scheme or color scheme that I selected was, instead of the blue-green, the blue. And this color scheme is this color sketch here. I think this one is more interesting because of the greater variety of color contrasts due to the irregular intervals of space between these colors. There are major, then there is a smaller interval, and then there is a very small interval of space between all these colors, creating varying degrees of color contrast. Some colors contrast more with each other than others, and therefore a variety of color contrasts is created that doesn't exist to the same extent within this example here. In this color sketch, there is the violet and the blue, which are more closely related, and therefore the contrast between these two colors is not as great as the contrast between the yellow and the blue. So now I have a greater color contrast in addition to this more minor color contrast. And then I have the greatest color contrast between the complementary colors of yellow and violet. So you see, there are a variety of color contrasts which help to make this color scheme more interesting than the other one in which I selected the blue-green. There isn't that kind of variety of color contrasts in this color scheme as there is in the other one. So therefore this one isn't as interesting in its color contrast as this one is. This irregularity that I've been talking about doesn't just pertain to irregularity of intervals of spacing between colors or values. Irregularity is the rule of composition and design, as I've already mentioned, that makes for interesting design and composition. Regularity is exact repetition, as I showed earlier. And therefore, in order to create the most interesting design and composition, irregularity must occur in all that you put into your composition, not just the color and the values. If you compare these two color sketches, you can see that in this one, there is a greater variety of sizes of areas or shapes. For example, the shape of the sky is much larger than the shape of the city. And the foreground shape is larger than the city. That sort of variety of sizes of areas and shapes doesn't exist in this example here. And therefore, this is not based on irregularity. Rather, since the sizes are more similar, it's more regular than irregular. And this one is based on irregularity of sizes. I'll show you what the shapes look like approximately, roughly. You see, here you can better tell what the sizes of these shapes are. And in this example, as you can see, the sizes are just too similar. They're competing for attention in terms of size. But here you can definitely see that one shape or area is much larger and dominating in terms of size over the other sizes of shapes. And this size is somewhat smaller than this size is. So each of these shapes has a different size, and therefore this arrangement is based on irregularity of sizes. And because of that, it's more interesting. In this diagram, those shapes that are near each other are more harmonious. They contrast less with each other than shapes that are further away. And those shapes that are farthest from each other, such as the circle and the triangle, contrast the most with each other. So there can be major and minor intervals between shapes, creating greater or lesser contrast with each other. Here again, the rule of irregularity applies because there are major and minor contrasts of shapes that are introduced into a painting. Here I did a very rough sketch to illustrate what can be done with an economy of shapes. That is, where you only select two shapes that will be in your composition. In this sketch, right now, there is only the triangle shape. But what happens is that the triangle is repeated throughout the composition and is varied by making some triangles longer, some shorter and smaller, some wider, but they're all triangles, and therefore they're all related. They do not contrast with each other as strongly as a shape like this, the circle with the triangle. These kind of contrasting shapes are more closely related, and it's more like these shapes here. But because of the variety of the different kinds of triangles that I introduced here in this sketch, there is a variety of different triangles which create interest. These kind of triangle shapes that I indicated here can be found throughout this rough sketch. And you can see one here, 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 here. They're to be found everywhere. And because the same kind of shape has been used throughout and repeated with variations, I've created a unified composition through the repetition of similar shapes. Even here, side of the man and the arm like that. All these shapes here and in my composition are all more or less closely related. Some contrast more because they are wider and some are narrower. There are different degrees of contrasting triangular shapes, but they're not major contrasts of shape like the circle and the triangle is. So I have contrasting shapes, but to a lesser degree than if I had introduced a circle into this composition. And that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to introduce a major contrast of shape. So I have both less contrasting shapes, minor contrasts of shape, as well as a major contrast of shape, which will add tremendously to the interest of this composition and help to create a focus or lead to the center of interest, which is this figure here. And now I'm going to add that circle shape, and by doing that, there is now more variety of shape, and that adds to the interest of the composition. Now I have a major contrasting shape as well as lesser contrasting shapes that are more harmonious because they're more closely related. And this circular shape acts as an accent shape, which draws your eye to the center of interest, which is the figure. Since I introduced this contrasting shape, and I only introduced one, I could introduce a couple more in other places within the composition, such as here, to add further interest. To help create even more interest throughout the composition, I can repeat this circular shape with variations in other parts of the composition, just as I repeated the triangle shape with variations throughout the composition. And if I do that, then a more balanced arrangement of circular and triangular shapes will result. But only one shape must predominate throughout the composition. That is, there needs to be more of one kind of shape than the other. If I introduce too many circular shapes, then I'll destroy the dominance of the triangular shapes. And that will result in a composition that is not unified. You'll wind up with competing shapes, and the composition will fall apart. It won't hold together. The best kind of compositions are those with an economy of shape. The composition gains a simplicity through this economy. And in this composition, there can be seen that kind of economy of shape, because I'm only using two shapes, the circular shape and the triangular shape. And then I'm creating variations on those shapes. But they're still basically circular and triangular shapes. I didn't introduce a rectangular shape. That would have complicated things too much, although that can be done if you know how to keep these shapes under control. It could add more interest by adding a third shape, but it's actually better to try to use fewer shapes and then create variations on those shapes. And thereby, your composition gains a simplicity, and through this simplicity, power and unity. So I haven't created the variations on the circular shape yet. I can do that by introducing some circular buildings. You see, right here and here. And also, I added this circular line here, this curve. And also another curve here and another one here. So I've introduced some variety of circular shapes and also curving lines that balance the straight lines that you see throughout the composition and provide some relief to all those straight lines. So by introducing these curved shapes here, and actually these curved lines make a curved shape also, you see? And then this curve here helps to make a curved shape, a partly curved shape. And also there's a curve here by the man's leg, like that. And then this part of his back is a little curved. So I've introduced a limited number of curved shapes and lines, not so many that they would then outnumber the triangular shapes, and thereby I would lose the dominance of the triangular shapes. These additional shapes and lines that contrast with the dominant shapes and lines provide the necessary balance to the composition that helps to create more interest through contrast. So the variations of the circular shape that I created, these here, actually relate to this shape, and you can see that it's just one shape removed from the circle. So these shapes are closely related. Shapes need to be irregular to be interesting. Regular shapes are the circle, or the triangle, or the square. Geometric shapes are regular shapes. They're not interesting, and they don't interlock with their backgrounds. Therefore, you need to create irregular shapes for your compositions to be interesting. And you can see this irregularity of shape throughout my composition. If I outline these shapes here, like this, you see, there is irregularity of shape. And then down here, irregularity of shape. That's what makes them interesting. And the same for the dark shape. Each one of these shapes is irregular. Again, the rule of irregularity, if you want to create interesting shapes. I talked extensively about shapes in my other videos, so I don't want to go into shapes too much here. Right now, I'm just concerned with irregularity. And if you didn't get a chance to see those other videos, you might want to check those out. Irregular intervals, or unequal intervals, as it can also be referred to, produce a variety of contrasts, major and minor, which make a composition more interesting. This is the purpose of irregular or unequal intervals, to provide a composition with this variety of different contrasts, of major and minor contrasts, and it applies to all of the elements of design that you see here. I already went over irregular intervals of values and of color, as well as shape. And what's left is line, direction, size, and texture. When working with line, for example, if I select, let's say, a straight line, and I put that into my composition, and the next line that I select is a line next to the straight line, which is slightly curved. These two lines do not contrast sharply with each other. They are in harmony. They are closely related. Therefore, there is a minor contrast between them. But the next line that I introduce could be one way over here. Therefore, the interval between these two lines and the next line is irregular, unequal. That next line that I introduce is farther away from these two lines, and therefore this other line is going to add a sharp contrast or a major contrast to the composition. So I have minor contrast as well as major contrast with this curve and this straight line here. The introduction of a major interval or difference or contrast, such as this curve that I introduced here, will further strengthen the unity of a composition or design. Now the same thing goes for direction. When working on your composition and you're establishing the direction of your horns, those directions that are near each other, such as this vertical and the one next to it, which is at a slight angle, will produce minor contrasts of direction. Then the next direction, the interval should be farther away, such as this horizontal here. And by introducing the horizontal, I now introduce a major interval or major contrast of direction. Thereby, I now have minor contrast of direction as well as major contrast of directions. The same goes for size. When deciding on what the sizes are going to be in your composition, those sizes that you establish that are near each other, that are closely related or resemble each other more, are going to create a minor contrast of size because the intervals between them are less. The next interval that I select in order to create a major contrast would be farther away, this size here. So I've established unequal or irregular intervals, thereby creating the major and minor contrast. So the next size that I introduce would be a large size like this. And now I have minor and major contrasts of size as a result of selecting unequal or irregular intervals. Here I did a real rough to show you what an actual composition looks like with this selection of irregular intervals or unequal intervals of sizes. You can see the major interval with this large spaceship here, and then the minor intervals between these two spacecraft that are more equal in size or similar in size than this large one is, which provides the major contrast of size. So there is major and minor contrasts of sizes within this little rough sketch. This rough sketch can also serve as an example for direction. I changed the direction of this spaceship somewhat to show you that these directions here are the same, and then I've introduced a different interval of direction here, which is slightly more at an angle than these two are, thereby establishing a minor contrast of direction here. And then I introduced a major interval of direction with this diagonal here. Now, what you also need to remember is that there are different degrees of major contrast. I can have an extreme major contrast of direction, such as its vertical and horizontal, or I can have a major contrast that is not quite as extreme by selecting this diagonal here and the vertical that you see here. This direction that introduces a major contrast of direction is, of course, not as strong as it could be if I had introduced a direction that is more at a right angle to these other directions. This direction would have introduced an even greater contrast because of the greater interval that I would have selected. So you see, there are varying degrees of contrast due to the introduction of irregular or unequal intervals. Avoid selecting the middle interval because that will result in less variety of contrasts, where you don't have those kind of major and minor contrasts to the degree that will create a lot of interest, the kind of contrast that you achieve if you select the middle interval will not be as interesting because the variety will not be as great. So avoid a middle interval like this line, which is right in the middle between the two extremes of the straight line and the curve. I've changed this sketch somewhat, as you can see, by introducing a greater major contrast of direction here, and thereby a greater variety of major and minor contrasts of direction have been established, which make this color sketch more interesting than the previous one. Now there is something I'd like to point out, and that is that this direction here had to be different from this direction and this direction in order to avoid obvious parallels, which would result in monotony of direction. If the direction of the middle spaceship were the same as the other two directions, you see I'd wind up with parallels, and this is something you need to avoid. Do not create parallels. They will create monotony because there is no variety in parallels. It's the same exact direction. You need to introduce differences, and I did that by slightly altering the direction of this smaller spacecraft, and thereby setting up minor contrasts of direction that are more in harmony, and this helps to create more interest because of the variety of direction. Now I'm talking about parallels that are obvious. Parallels are used in compositions to bind one area with another, to link one with another, as long as those parallels are not made obvious, like they would be in this case if I had changed this direction to be the same direction as this and this one. With texture, the same irregular intervals or unequal intervals should be selected in order to create major and minor contrasts of texture, like you see in this example here. These two textures are similar. They are rough compared to this soft texture. However, this rough texture is more rough than this one. So there are a variety of different degrees of contrasting textures due to the different irregular intervals that were selected for the textures. Those textures, again, that are next to each other, just as with the line and the directions and the values, the same applies to textures. Those that are next to each other are less contrasting and represent a short interval. Then, to add more contrast, a major interval needs to be established, either all the way to the end here, or maybe just to this one. It depends on how much contrast you want to put into your composition. If I selected the first texture, which is smooth, and then the last one, which is very rough, and then the next texture that I select is the middle texture, then I wind up with contrasts of textures that do not have the kind of variety of contrasts that irregular intervals have, because now I wind up with equal intervals between the textures. The important rule of composition to remember is never to make two intervals the same. If I selected an interval here, where these textures are, the next interval should not be the same interval. If you do that, then you wind up with what I just showed you. A smooth, a rough, and then the middle texture that should be avoided. Not the middle texture should be selected, but either this one next to the smooth or this one next to the rough. Thereby, unequal distances of intervals would be used. When you're working out your composition, you don't think in terms of diagrams like this. You think in terms of major and minor contrasts that you want to establish. So with values, I'm thinking, well, I'm going to indicate a dark in my composition, and then I'm going to indicate a lighter value to create a major contrast of values, and then I'm thinking now I need to introduce minor value contrast. So I'll introduce a value that is either closer to the dark or closer to the light, but not one that falls between the light and the dark here. So I'll indicate one value that's closer to the dark, and thereby I have now established major and minor value contrast. I don't have a value scale in front of me to check my values. I don't need that. That's not how it works. You think in terms of how similar are these values, and if they're similar, you know that they're close on the value scale. Therefore, a short interval exists between them. And you know that if the values are not similar and they are more different, then you know that there is a greater interval between them. So you know that you have irregular intervals or unequal intervals that you're working with. And you don't need to check the value scale. And so it goes for all of the elements of design. When you create your compositions, try to create arrangements that form irregularity rather than regularity. In a regular composition such as this one, the forms on the left are the same as on the right. There is no dominance, like you see here in this example, where this large shape dominates over the smaller one. And that can be seen in this rough sketch that I did here to illustrate that idea. Here is the large form on the right, and the smaller ones on the left balance the larger ones on the right, and a variety of sizes is created. That is, an irregularity of sizes, which is illustrated here in this diagram of a weighing scale. You see two different sizes. There is an irregularity of sizes, and this creates variety, and through variety, interest is achieved. In this arrangement that produces regularity, there is repetition, such as in this diagram and what I talked about earlier, exact repetition. And in this kind of symmetrical arrangement, there is no dominance. There is no one form or shape that dominates over the others in terms of size. If you look at this weighing scale, both of these shapes are of the same size. There is no dominance. No one shape is larger than the other, like in this example. And if you have this kind of repetition of forms and shapes, then there is no dominance and there is no variety of sizes of forms like you see in this example. And if your composition lacks this variety of sizes, then you're going to wind up with a boring composition. It is through the variety of sizes, of shapes and forms and colors and values, that interest is created. And interest is created through irregularity. Regularity produces exact repetition like this, and then you wind up with this kind of boring symmetrical composition without the variety needed to create interest. The basis for all interesting compositions is irregularity, which creates variety. And now I'd like to say a word about unity. I already talked extensively about how unity is created, and I showed you in a comprehensive way how it's done in Volume 8 of the Art Track video series. So if you didn't get a chance to see that video, and you want to learn about how unity is achieved through dominance, then you'll need to get a hold of that video. But I will say some things about it here that I may not have mentioned in Volume 8, which is very important. First of all, unity is the primary principle of aesthetic order, and it initiates the secondary principles of conflict and dominance, which is what I have already talked about in Volume 8. Unity, the prime essential of design, means cohesion, consistency, oneness, or integrity. Unity demands that conflict or the tension between competing visual forces, as I have shown you, be resolved and integrated, and I showed you how this integration takes place through dominance. Unity can initiate conflict. For example, in this example, there is unity because the same shape has been repeated and the same value has been repeated, as well as the same size. So all three dimensions are repeated. There is nothing that dominates over the other. Therefore, your attention is torn between the two shapes. You don't know where you should rest your eye. Each shape says, "Look at me." And this is what you see in this rough color sketch here. Each side says, "Look at me." Each side is competing for attention with the other side because there is no dominance. Once dominance is introduced, this conflict is then resolved. The conflict initiated by unity. In this example, that conflict that exists here has been resolved through dominance. Dominance of size, by making this shape larger than the other shape. That conflict that exists here between these two shapes now no longer exists here, specifically because of dominance of size. And you can see what a difference that makes in this rough color sketch compared to this one. Now, there is dominance of this form over the others in terms of size, just as in this diagram here. There is more unity here than there is here because of this dominance. You can have more or less unity. Here, unity is achieved through repetition. Here, it is also achieved through repetition, the same shape, the same value, but with the addition of the dominance of size, it makes this arrangement more unified than this. Also, this arrangement has more variety because of dominance than this arrangement, which doesn't have that kind of variety of sizes that this has. I made a change here, as you can see, as well as in the color sketch. Here, I changed the square to a circle, and these opposing shapes are equal in size. Neither dominates, and because of that, there is disunity, just as in this color sketch here, where this shape is a different shape from this one, which is more oval, just as I have different shapes here. Therefore, just as in this diagram here, so it is with this rough sketch, that there is disunity because of the opposing shapes, just as there are opposing shapes in this diagram. I also made some changes to these examples, as you can see. Now there are two opposing shapes here, just as there are here. But in this diagram, there is dominance of size, and because of that, there is unity. And also within this rough color sketch, there are two opposing shapes, just as there are two opposing shapes here. One is more oval, and the other is more like a pyramid. But because this pyramid-like shape dominates through size over this oval, there is unity. And also I added a couple more buildings that echo this pyramid shape. And that also increases the feeling of unity. Because of the variety of sizes and shapes in this rough color sketch and in this diagram, as opposed to these examples, these are therefore much more interesting than these examples. These diagrams illustrate the different kinds of balance that are found in each of these examples. This rough color sketch uses a symmetrical balance, as seen on this weighing scale here. That's because each side is the same as the other side, therefore it's called a symmetrical balance, and this kind of balance doesn't have any movement and is not dynamic, as opposed to this kind of balance, which is a more informal balance and is called asymmetrical balance. There is balance between dissimilar elements, and in symmetrical balance there is balance between similar elements, or elements that are exactly the same. This kind of asymmetrical balance creates movement because the eye moves from the larger size to the smaller sizes. So the eye moves throughout the composition, and therefore it is a dynamic balance. And therefore it's much more interesting than the static symmetrical balance seen here. Since these two shapes and these shapes oppose each other rather strongly, how is the subordinate shape, which is the smaller shape, in my sketch here it's this building compared to this larger shape, how is this subordinate shape integrated with the opposing dominant shape if they are so different? There are various dimensions that are different. So there has to be another dimension or dimensions that are the same or similar in order to integrate the subordinate with the dominant. Since they contrast in size, in line, one has straight edges, the other a curved edge. They have the same texture, which is a smooth texture. So there's one dimension right there that unites them. The shapes are different, so they can't be integrated through shape, but they can be integrated through value. They both share the same value, in addition to the same texture. The same goes for my color sketch. However, in my color sketch, I have the additional dimension of color that integrates these two opposing shapes. So if I added blue to this circle and to the square, there would be an additional dimension that would further help to unite these two opposing shapes, integrate them, unify them. What's important to remember when composing your own compositions is that the subordinate shapes, the smaller shapes, compared to the larger dominant sizes, that these subordinate units or shapes be integrated with a dominant. That dominant can be any one of the elements of design, except size. Otherwise, you have to make the subordinate the same size as the dominant, and then you would no longer have dominance of size, and therefore you'd have less unity. So that subordinate or subordinates can be integrated with any one of the dominants, that is, any one of the elements of design that take up the greatest amount of area, either through size or repetition, resulting in an accumulated size. And I talked about this in Volume 8. So if you need to review Volume 8 or you haven't seen Volume 8, please check it out. In my rough color sketch here, there is more blue than any other color. And so I use the dimension of color by repeating the dominant blue color within my subordinate shapes or units. I integrate those subordinate shapes with a dominant, just as you see here in this diagram, where I repeated the blue of the dominant within the subordinate shape. Always repeat what the dominant is within the subordinate, not vice versa, where you repeat what is in the subordinate shape within the dominant. It's the other way around. I added some tonal variations to both of these sketches, as you can see, to give them a little form and to make them a little more realistic looking. But even though I did that to this sketch, it still is boring. So no amount of additions of tonal variations or anything else that I do to this sketch is going to make it more interesting than this one. This one will always be more interesting, no matter what else I add to this sketch. This will always be more interesting because of the irregularity of the shape that I created. I'm going to do another little very rough sketch to show you that you need to be aware of the spaces between your shapes or forms. The intervals of space between those forms must be irregular. And in this case, I'm going to do a little rough sketch of trees that have regular spacing, which means that the spaces or intervals of space are all the same. And this will create a boring interval of spaces. Irregularity comes into play with all of the elements of design, even space. No matter what I add here, leaves or mountains in the distance, doesn't matter. If I keep the spacing between these trees the same and do not vary the width of these trees, but keep the width of the trees also the same, so there is regularity in the trees as well as in the spaces between the trees. No matter what I do to this sketch, it's going to remain boring. I'm going to show you another sketch, this one based on irregularity rather than regularity. And as you can see, there is a dramatic difference. All of these intervals of space have been varied so that no two are exactly the same width. And one is dominant. This width of space, or interval of space, is wider than all the others. Also, I've varied the width of the trees, with this one here being the widest. And again, dominance of width, with others narrower, and this one a middle width. So there is a variety of intervals of space as well as a variety of the width of the trees, or the width of the form or shape. And not only that, but there's also irregularity of direction. This direction is similar to this and this, but now I have another direction, and this one I've introduced some irregularity of direction, and that irregularity of direction is lacking in this sketch, where all these trees go in exactly the same direction. And because of this, all these trees parallel each other. And parallelism is something that needs to be avoided within a composition if it becomes too obvious. Parallels are used to strengthen a composition and to bind one part of a composition with another, but they must not become too obvious. Another thing I'd like to point out is, you see how all the trees are aligned at the bottom? Well, this is regularity of positioning, and it's very boring. I'm going to make a change in this sketch here and show you what an irregularity of positioning does. You see, now some trees sit higher up, some lower, some even lower, like this big tree, and then some a little higher, and then some that are even higher. So there is a staggering of positioning of the trees, resulting in irregularity of positioning, and therefore a more interesting arrangement of positioning of the trees has occurred because of this irregularity. In this very rough sketch, I just want to quickly point out something else. When you position your forms, the height of these spacecraft that are taking off are all different. You see, the height is staggered, irregular, as well as the bottom of these spaceships are at different heights. So there's a staggering throughout. So try to create this irregularity in the positioning of your forms within the composition. Don't align them at the top. For example, if I brought this spaceship up further, as you can see, now these spaceships align at the top, and there is no longer this irregularity that I had before. And therefore, this arrangement isn't as interesting, because each height needs to be different, resulting in irregularity rather than regularity. And this will help to make your compositions more interesting. I'd like to mention something quickly about shapes, and this is very important. As I mentioned before, there should be an economy of shapes. Fewer shapes make a better design or composition. Now, what I'm about to say doesn't refer to using a fewer number of different kinds of shapes, as I pointed out, like a circle and a triangle instead of an additional shape, a rectangular shape. But what I'm referring to here is to create fewer number of shapes by linking together shapes. For example, in this rough color sketch, these shapes are all linked together. They are connected. But if I started to disconnect them like this, now each of these shapes is separate, and therefore I wind up with more shapes in the composition than if I connected them like this. Now I have one shape instead of four individual shapes, and therefore I've simplified the composition, and thereby the composition is strengthened and unified because the shapes have all been connected now into one unified shape through the same value. It's the value of this shape with this shape with this shape that is the same, that links them, that connects them, that forms this one overall shape.